Welcome everyone. This is Nuestro South Podcast Loud and Proud. Mi nombre es Axel Herrera and I'm your host. Our conversation today focuses on el poder político and the people power that we Latinx folks can build and exercise across the South. We have a special guest today. It is our very own Ricky Hurtado. He is a son of Salvadoran immigrants, co-founder of LatinxEd, and newly elected North Carolina House Representative of District 63, and of course, one of the visionaries for this Nuestro South Project. So Ricky, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hey Axel, it's good to be here today. Always fun to chat about all things political, educational, just all the things, right?
Yeah, no, I'm assuming that it's very busy time, so it's great for you to be here. And it's great to, just bring you to the front. You've been one of the minds working behind the scenes to develop this idea of Nuestro South and support it. So I am super excited to get you, speaking to our audience, speaking to our youth as one of the most important leaders of this project.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, I've been working in the background, right? But I guess it's time for me to come to the forefront.
Enseñar la sonrisa, the new haircut, all that.
I got a fresh cut today just for the pod. So.
Oh, look at you, man. I'm still out here, man. This is like what, a year and 2 months in progress now.
I've been going back and forth, Axel. I don't know. I was like, do I want to be Axel when I grow up, right, with the hair and all? So no, I can't commit.
I'm gonna bald, so who knows? There's las entradas. But okay, anyways, let's just get started. I have some quick questions, and then I think you have some great insight on some of those experiences you've had recently, because a lot has happened in the past year. So first, I want to get some questions so that folks get to know just a little quick fun things about you. And we'll start with food, because food is always a great place to start. So you've grown up in North Carolina. You could maybe introduce where specifically, but I wanted to ask you currently or historically, what's one of your favorite Southern food spots or maybe Latinx, Latino food spots in North Carolina?
Ooh, food is always a good question to start with. I love chicken and waffles. And so we're talking about like traditional sort of like Southern cuisine, right? I'm thinking fried chicken, I'm thinking, sweet and savory. And there's spots in Durham and in Greensboro. It's actually a restaurant that I worked with for a little bit right after college called Dame's Chicken and Waffles.
You worked there?
I didn't work there. I worked with them. They wanted to think about how they franchise the restaurant, and I was working at a consulting firm, and so we were talking around how we support their business model, right? And so it was like on the back end side of it, which meant we had a lot of meetings at Dame's Chicken and Waffles. And so good food, right? But I'm sort of obsessed with the idea of like, what does this fusion of our cultures, right? Like the immigrant Latinx presence in North Carolina, what does it mean for our food culture, right? And so I remember back a few years ago, we started sort of toying around like what does it look like to infuse the Southern flavors that we often see in our communities in pupusas, right? Like you said in my bio, right? Like I am the son of Salvadoran immigrants, and any pupusa spot is like my number one go-to anywhere. And so yeah, that's sort of maybe my pet project in the future is like how do we combine some barbecue flavors with some pupusas and really make that work,
That's probably one of the few spots that I haven't seen that much like, fusion and mixing, like with empanadas or things like that, you see a lot. But my spot for pupusas since about a year ago, and I was trying to find some businesses to do new things, to like interview. And it's this food truck in like by Miami Boulevard in Durham. It's called Doña Laura. They were great, honestly. Just FYI, I guess. Growing up here in North Carolina, where did most Latinos that you knew work?
I have a very biased perception of this growing up. I grew up in rural North Carolina, in Sanford, in Lee County, and this place really transformed demographically, right? When we arrived, it was less than 5% Latino, and now it's over 25% Latino. And so what I saw was what my dad did, right? He worked at the local waste management industry company, right? Drove a garbage truck. And then I ended up, when I turned 16, I got a job there too. And so everyone around me was Latino, right? And so I saw folks doing the hard work, right? There's a construction site beside us too, right? And so you sort of saw like folks that looked like my dad and me sort of at the front lines of doing a lot of the hard labor in Lee County. Lee County is also known as Brick City, and so there's a lot of clay there, and so folks working in construction and manufacturing and stuff like that. But yeah, that's sort of what Sanford showed me growing up.
Was it work that brought your family there, or other reasons?
Um, Partly so I was born in LA. Like many Salvadoran families, my parents fled the Civil War in El Salvador in 1980. And so they were 20 years old. They fled right before the assassination of Archbishop Romero. And then they found themselves in Los Angeles, right? Living in the shadows, undocumented, but fleeing for their safety. They were able to benefit from comprehensive immigration reform in the 80s. And then eventually when I was born in LA, lived a few years there, and it got really untenable, right? Like it was right after, there's this sort of perfect storm of racial justice issues. So police brutality, the Rodney King riots in LA really scared my parents. They're just like, it was the first sort of taste of what racial injustice in America could look and feel like. And they weren't really sure what was going on. And then also, we lived in the city, right? And pollution, is a natural part that comes with our communities in these urban areas. And so I was actually literally dying of asthma. Had to get 2 shots every day, sleep with a respirator every night. And so one of my dad's best friends growing up moved to North Carolina after first arriving in LA. So similar path, right? And sort of how our communities moved together. Like they all left El Salvador and they all landed in LA, and then he left LA to go to North Carolina, and just called my dad one day. I was just like, it's really green here, right? Like I can get you a job. And so my dad literally sold everything. Our family sold everything, bought a custom trailer, hooked it to the back of my dad's station wagon, fit a few things that we're going to take with us. And we drove across the country, and we landed in Sanford, North Carolina, out of all places.
Out of all, I mean, that's the biggest thing with some of these like migratory movements. There's like so many different factors that like just influence where you end up, that it seems random, but it's just a very complicated pathway for us to get here. And I totally hear the like pollution and stuff. I was seeing recently like some data that like California has actually been fairly successful in doing a lot of going in a positive trend, and but most of the world suffers in a lot of ways. But the thing that comes to mind is that like the thing about the South or North Carolina, that there's areas that are bad, but generally, I think other than the pollen storms you get here, it's a very nice like environment and like air to like be in, right? The sense of like going to a place that's tranquilo, or my mom like deciding to leave New York because there were trees here. Like that's something that I guess I've taken for granted for so many years, but they keep coming up in these conversations.
Yeah, no, they do, right? And I think it probably has something to do with our parents' upbringing, right? Like growing up in El Campo and like El Salvador and places like that, where they're just like, they don't, I guess, frame it in this way, but they crave sort of rural communities, right? And we find ourselves in the South. And I feel like that's the story of so many of our families who have relocated here for economic reasons, but also, like you said, it's más tranquilo, right? And so that's what they say, right? It's más tranquilo. Yeah. What do they mean by that, right? It's interesting.
It's a whole thing to unpack in itself. That's hilarious to hear, but no, totally sympathize in many ways. All right, next question. I'm gonna ask you this before the last one, because you work in education, so I'm gonna skip to this one. I want to hear about your experience with education. So what were your friends like during grade school?
I was always fighting imposter syndrome in my K-12 education, and I was always fighting sort of feelings of alienation and isolation, right? Wanting to feel like I belonged, whether it was language, whether it was sort of what I was studying, right? The neighborhood that I grew up in, etc. And so my clearer memories start kicking in like in middle school, where like friend groups start to sort of evolve, right? And then I begin to get tracked into sort of like honors courses, like gifted courses and all that. And so I felt this distinct tension because I lived in a predominantly Black and brown neighborhood, right? Remember going home, we'd play soccer in the backyard, we'd play pickup basketball in the streets. Like that was my reality from like 3 p.m. to like
Yeah.
midnight. And then whenever you think about what my reality was from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., it was sort of very different, right? It was in classrooms that were predominantly white. I was usually the only brown or black face in that classroom, and my interactions with them looked and felt really different. And so it was always sort of this constant, like, where do I belong, right? Where, because I felt like I was constantly navigating different worlds. And on top of that, also sort of feeling like when I was in the school building, in my classrooms, both with my peers and my educators, right, the teachers in the classroom, like there wasn't a shared experience, right? There weren't teachers that sort of knew what it was like to grow up like me. And so I remember really struggling with that. And part of me wanting to run away from Sanford and Lee County was sort of not just a college, right, to get a better education, but and you know, greater opportunity, but it was like sort of this journey, right, of like finding who I was and where I belonged in this community.
There's this very specific phrase that I remember one time getting off the bus in apartments. This was high school, and then I guess by that time I had like just moved to Durham. I had introduced myself, and folks knew I was like in like these honors classes or AP classes. And one of the guys asked me like, he's like, "Yo, if you're smart, how come you live in the hood?" I was like, yeah, this is essentially what encompasses like the dynamic that you're describing, right? It's like, I remember leaving the classrooms where I had most of my friends to be placed in different classrooms, like in the middle of the year. So I feel that, and that was like starting since elementary school. That's a whole other topic to discuss as well. But that's essentially some of the experiences that inspire your work now.
Yeah, that's so true. That quote completely encompasses my whole K through 12 experience. I said it in 5 minutes. You said it in one sentence, right? Yeah, that's exactly the tension that you felt growing up, right?
Yeah. And so last question about your family and kind of just living in this area growing up. What were some like weekend or leisure activities as a family when you were younger?
Very interesting. I've gotten this question a lot, right? Because I've done a few interviews
Okay.
in the campaign and stuff. I don't, I mean, my parents were always working, right? I
Hmm.
feel like there was like rest time for me. It wasn't always family rest time because we were always on different schedules. And I feel like that was part of the challenges growing up. I remember on weekends when leisure time for us, I became like what it looked like for my family looked different for me because I started playing soccer pretty early. And my parents didn't have the means or the time to be taking me to every away game, right? To take me to soccer practice and all that. And so one of my best friends growing up, right? Like their family essentially took me under their wing, was just, like you can just come with us, right? And so my weekends with family wasn't with my family. It was family, right? We'd go to like the soccer tournaments together, right? We'd leave town. Like I got to see all of North Carolina, right? And it was part of what I'm realizing now, sort of as an adult, how expensive that is, everything I did. But it was like family, friends, or friends of, yeah, like the family of my friend who essentially paid for all that, right? And so I feel like in some ways that did create some distance between me and my parents because I was like out exploring North Carolina and they're like either working or like chilling with the family. And so I feel like once I got to high school, my weekends then became soccer plus working, and I had like 3 jobs in high school. I was like working at the dump with my dad on Saturday, so I would wake up at like 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. and make sure I was there by like 7:30. And I would run the transfer station where all the big trucks come in. I'd weigh them, tell them if any of their waste was contaminated and they couldn't dump it, right? And then they'd go dump it in the dump. And then I'd work, most of the day. And during the week, I would work at a hospital warehouse filing x-rays just for some extra cash, and at the ballpark selling hot dogs, And so it was
Always
like
hustling.
always hustling, right? And I didn't even tell you about my stories in third grade. I would like sell airheads and paletas in my neighborhood, right? So I guess I've always been conscious of sort of money and sort of like, some of the challenges my family's faced. But yeah, I feel like I've had this sort of like, I gotta like take care of myself and my family's like mentality for a while. And so leisure, I guess I haven't had a lot of leisure on the weekends most of my life. I find myself working a lot.
So, so I asked that question because I think there's like certain things that we like our family dynamics like tend to adapt to like the circumstances we lived in. But there's always things that kind of come up to the surface that like become like the one thing. This idea of like a vacation or a getaway just never really exists for many immigrant working families. But you know, these like weird or niche things that we did do come to mind. And it's so weird that like, so work is a positive memory for me, right? I remember when we first moved to Alamance, actually, I remember like, I was like, what, 8 or like 10 or something. And I would be like stocking some of the grocery items on these shelves of this new grocery store that they were starting, Compare Foods. And then people would ask me, they were like, do you work here? Because I was literally a child, right? I was probably maybe a little taller, but I was still a child. And they're like, no, I'm just helping my parents. And I feel that, and you know, for them, yeah, weekends, they started getting weekends. I was like off about like 2 or 3 years ago, after, you know, over decades of being here. My stepdad longer than my mom, so I feel that.
Yeah, and I think yeah, when we did have weekends free, I mean the trek out was grocery shopping, you know. So that was the thing we did as a family, you know.
Yeah, no, I feel that. All right, so thanks so much. I'm glad that we got to know a little bit more about those stories. I even didn't know some of them. El paletero de tercer grado. Okay, so I want to get a little bit more into, I guess, the topics of what this podcast has been covering, which is like poder y cultura, and kind of like this awareness of you know, what is this existence of Latinos in the South. Then I want to start with your relationship with Latinidad, or this identity of immigrant or parent immigrants from El Salvador. So what is your relationship to your Latinidad? How do you kind of describe that to people?
Yeah,
or practice it?
that's an interesting question. Even if we go back to some of our initial conversation here around education and growing up in the South, I was really resistant to my Latinidad for a really long time. I was, like I said, I was trying to figure out where I belonged, right? And one of my earliest memories in middle school, right, was like a close friend of mine. We're chatting on AIM, as one does, right, at that age. I don't know if you know about that, Axel, but you know,
I do not.
AOL Instant Messenger used to be a thing, right? It was Facebook before it was Facebook, right? And I remember her saying, like, I thought we were super tight, right? This is like 7th grade, and she's like, "Oh, to me, you're just like another Mexican by the side of the road." And I knew what she meant by that, but it just sort of hit me from left field, super offended. And so I actually developed this really complicated relationship with sort of the Mexican identity too, right? Yeah. Because I'm not Mexican. Mexicans is or the term Mexican and just the Mexican identity is used in a pejorative, like negative way in our community. I don't want to be associated with that, right? And so I'm just like, I'm not Mexican. I don't really have a Salvadoran community here. I speak Spanish. So I'm just like all these questions and like internal sort of I guess oppressive sort of thoughts that you sort of internalize, right? And so for me, I was sort of like really trying to say like, nah, but I'm not like that, right? I don't know what that meant at the time, but I was really trying to create distance from the kids they were describing, whatever that meant. I think it wasn't until college, and at the very tail end of college, right, where I began to sort of think more critically about race, ethnicity, gender, and identity. And it was actually through learning about the history of racial injustice in this country where I began to sort of learn more about myself and my community, right? I always had questions about my parents' immigration journey, and that wasn't something that we talked about a lot growing up, not because they were hiding anything, but I don't know if they thought that we were interested or they were trying to protect us or something. But as you grow older, you have questions, right? And so I think that college gave me the opportunity to explore our immigrant history as a family, to really think about what that meant growing up in North Carolina, to think about sort of racial justice and injustice in America. And then I sort of took a deep dive into what it meant to be a person of color in America, right? And like, do I identify as that, right? And so that sort of just led me to a completely different pathway that I thought I would be going to after college, where it just like really began to connect the dots between income and social inequality and race and racial injustice in America. And especially in the South, where we sort of struggle with this historical black-white binary, and then sort of introduce this narrative around and complicate the narrative around, well, Latinos have lived here for a while now, right? And as we've talked about on this podcast too, right? Actually, that while is a lot longer than most people realize.
Yeah.
And so I think that sort of put me on a path where going to grad school and then, founding LatinxEd, or just like this sort of journey to sort of explore your own identity and the identity of your community was actually a really important part of my success, because I think that this notion of belonging was actually really holding me back in school. Like sort of it was like it was impacting my mental and emotional health, right? And you begin to sort of see now when we started doing this work in education, where you begin to see sort of yourself and the things you said, the things you thought in middle school and high school, and how toxic that can be, right? And so I think my sort of relationship with Latinidad, right, has completely changed, right? Where I sort of wear my identity on my sleeve now, right? And really sort of, it's important for people to understand sort of the diversity in our community and what it means to be, and not like be Latino, right? I think the other part of this conversation too is sort of Latinidad also being, I talked to Elaine, the other co-founder of LatinxEd, about this a lot, right? But Latinidad being this notion, this desire for us to, again, a question of belonging, and this desire for us to connect, because we're trying to connect the dots between so many diverse communities and nationalities. Like does being Latino really even mean anything, right? Because so many of our parents are so rooted in their national identity, right? Of being Mexican, of being Salvadorian. And then we're sort of trying to sort of paint this broad picture of who we are as a community, and then get really frustrated when like the media or everything else messes it up.
Doesn't
right?
click.
At all, right? We're just like, it's so, your South American and Central American and Mexican experiences can be so different at times, right? And sometimes the only thing connecting us, and even this is limited, right, is language. And so it's something that I have fully embraced, but continue to sort of be open to the complications of what this means as this identity evolves as well, because I think that's the unique and fun part about being a child of immigrants right now, is just like we sort of get to define that identity as we want in the South, as we sort of figure out our place in this community too.
I think it's so fascinating that the generational differences, especially like our parents, but then even amongst us, I think can be different. When you come as an immigrant, or whether you grow up here. One of our other hosts, Daisy, had this experience where she was born here, left, and then came back, right? So like those nuances have an insane effect on what eventually happens. Because for me, I guess I always had this clear, distinct picture of like the immigration journey that I myself went through, right? But I kind of lost, or chose not to like hold on to any national identity, especially as I was growing up through here, because of the people I was surrounded by. You talk about like not having that much of a Salvadoran community. I also did in Alamance County, which is mainly where I had a like grade middle school and a little bit of high school. But when I come to Durham, then I'm like, Hondurans are just like in my face. I'm like, oh, there you guys are, which is hilarious, because I had by this time developed the sense that like, I'm an immigrant, right? That was kind of the strongest really identity that I had. So there's so much diversity of experience, and I totally get that. There's a lot to unpack, and a lot to unpack within the South. So I want to ask you, the next one is, what is your relationship to the South?
Yeah, similar sort of evolution, where the South was somewhere I was trying to run away from. I was trying to run away from my Latinidad. I was trying to run away from the South, because I didn't always, I didn't, right? Growing up, it wasn't necessarily the warmest memories that I had, right? Like I love my family and they're important to me, but I was trying to get the hell out of here, right? Just like my sort of part of my sort of vision of going to college was to get a good job. And then you see everyone around you, right? They're like moving to big cities, they're moving across the country, moving internationally. I'm just like, why would I want to stay in North Carolina, right? I guess and I asked that question because I guess I didn't see it as my community, because I was struggling so much with just like seeing myself as a North Carolinian, right? And so I had to leave, actually. So I left for a few years, went to grad school, traveled some, And it was being away from the South where I became a Southerner, where I like fully embraced that identity, where I began to realize just like being outside of the region and getting to meet different people, I was like, oh, I'm so from the South, right? Just in terms of my dialect, how I spoke, sort of like fond memories, right? I found myself sort of longing for North Carolina and began to realize that it was a community that very much shaped me. And it was a place that I very much belonged to. And that was really up to me, not up to the community, right? Like I that was sort of my claim of ownership, right? Of saying like, no, like no one can take that away from you, right? I think part of what influenced that is sort of how other folks identify so strongly with their regions, right? Like if you're from California, you're in New York or DC or, Texas. And I'm like, no, I'm from North Carolina. This is how we do things, And so I began to I very unknowingly sort of really began to sort of grapple and grasp that identity. And I think the part that really sealed it for me is this sudden hunger to go back, where you began to sort of had an opportunity to sort of leave and really reflect on where you've been and where you want to go, and just really feeling like there's a lot of unanswered questions in terms of how I fit into the picture, and I want to go explore those in North Carolina. And so I came back and yeah, I think it's coming back and then finding my people, right? Just like-minded folks, even folks that had been in my life for a long time, and sort of finally saw those relationships for what it meant, right? It was I began to sort of see also a different side of the South, right? The new South, if you want to call it that, right? Where a really diverse community, and was actually really excited about what that could mean for the future of North Carolina.
It's also interesting because I think, again, generations here matter and the timeline matters, right? And coming back, well, I had this experience where I was in an internship program with a lot of like California, Chicago, and like Texas, like Latinos, and like it had kind of this like reflection point when I was like, wow, these people are like living in a totally different place. And then one of my other friends was actually from Honduras. She was like from South Carolina, Myrtle Beach, and we were like, yeah, we know where we're coming from. So it's a great way to like, yeah, that diversity of experience of this area matters. And I think maybe probably more importantly, I think you found the younger generations who are growing up here who kind of like the way they're developing is different, but also you have an opportunity to influence how they develop as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a part of finding home here, right? It's sort of identifying with folks who have the same vision that you have for North Carolina, who probably face similar struggles and lived experiences, and then thinking about, well, how do we sort of build something beautiful together here in the state? Whether that's the students that we teach or that are part of our organization, peers, right, like yourself and other folks, right? It's just like there was a community here that I didn't know existed, and it's the more time you spend here, the bigger it gets, and that's I think the really exciting part about really feeling finally at home in North Carolina.
Yeah, no, you've painted an amazing picture of really your journey, which I was actually going to ask more about, how you became involved, but you've told a great narrative that question doesn't need to be asked. So I wanted to ask more tangibly. Nuestro South is also associated with partnering with LatinxEd, and by being a co-founder of that, I would love to introduce maybe a little bit more of what that vision or original mission was, and what you're seeing it now and or what it could be.
Yeah, for LatinxEd, you're saying?
Yeah, for LatinxEd.
On the one hand, LatinxEd's mission is really straightforward and simple and direct, and that's around expanding educational opportunity for Latinx students, right, from immigrant families in North Carolina, and maybe one day across the Southeast, right? What that looks like is relatively traditional around getting through high school, finding support to go to college, and really seeing yourself as a leader in the community. But I think on the other hand, we actually have in the community that we're building and just really embedded in our mission is really this vision of a more racially equitable North Carolina and what that means, right? And really a huge problem that we see around the fact that all of us growing up in our public schools and in our college campuses didn't necessarily see ourselves and our stories reflected in the curriculum in our school teachers, in the staff, right? I mean, you name it, right? We have felt invisible for really long. I Part of what influenced the vision for LatinxEd for me was that I spent a summer in Oakland, California, during grad school, and I was doing policy work out there. I was doing organizing with youth. We are going to Capitol, and it just felt good. It felt right, in terms of organizing Black and Brown youth in California, and really thinking about them finding their voice, finding their own agency as they build collective political power in what they consider that, their community. And there were moments where I was surrounded by other community leaders who looked like me, who had similar history and lived experience, and I was like, wow, what would it look like to have that in North Carolina? Does that exist? Do these people exist there, right? Or are we still so early in our sort of immigrant narrative to really find that? And so I quickly realized that those people did exist, but we needed to build something in North Carolina to sort of really activate that community. And it was, for me too, it was part of my way of paying it forward, right? I was blessed with educational opportunity, right? Got a scholarship to Carolina, got a scholarship to go to Princeton. And so I was really sort of thinking about, well, I'm not burdened with student debt like a lot of years, right? And I am truly grateful for these opportunities, and my eyes have opened to what sort of some of the root causes of inequality and, racial injustice are in our country. What is my role in all this conversation? And asking those questions at the same time, knowing I couldn't do it by myself. And we had to sort of build a movement around those notions. And so LatinxEd for us is essentially, as Elaine always puts it, it's a love letter to our former selves, right? Like, what would we have needed to be successful, more successful in our K through 12 experience, in our college experience, for us to truly feel like we belonged and we could really dream, fearlessly in that space. So much of our journeys was one of survival, where we sort of had our nose to the grindstone, head down. And really for me was fear, right? Like fear of failure, sort of fear of not being able to support my family. Like what drove me was poverty, right? I was just like, I need to get a good job to then be able to support my parents, because I know they can't work this backbreaking labor forever. And I need to figure out how to contribute to my family. And thankfully I've been given opportunities to dream bigger than that, to sort of think about not just me supporting my family, but all of us supporting our community, right?
Yeah.
And that looks more than just getting a job, right? That means building political power, being civically engaged, and really making sure we are changing the structures that are holding some of our communities back. And so it goes really quickly from a small vision to a big vision, but for me, it's like education is the cornerstone of our economy and our democracy, right? And it all starts there. And I think that the more that we see our stories reflected in our environment and in our curriculum, the more empowered our students feel to really be that change that we want them to be in their community.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I take away from that is that it's something that I've also personally like interacted with this. It's like a lot of moments for those who are successful during grade school or college. You kind of have this like narrow view that you're saying, it's like, let me make it out, right? And that's very individualistic. It's very personal. It's maybe also family oriented, but to get to the step of like where you start thinking of like what does my community success mean, takes a lot. And one, it maybe takes you having to see it somewhere, right? And so like now maybe you saw that in California or other places, but being able to see it here, being able to have students like see that through LatinxEd, they're like, oh, this is how I can redefine like what my trajectory is going to be. So that's amazing. That's great. I think that's one of the special parts about this project, that we're trying to also translate some of that mission that LatinxEd has by sharing our stories and our journeys through the South.
No, absolutely right. Absolutely. I think that the vision is one in the same in terms of how these stories translate to impact in our communities. So absolutely.
One of the parts that you started like going at right here, it's how this translates into political power and civic engagement. So the other huge portion of this conversation that I wanted to discuss, because this is probably exclusive. I mean, how long you been in office? Like a few months now.
Yeah.
So it's been a few months, but basically this past November during the general elections, there was a lot of things happening, but you were also on the ballot. So I want to start with how did you come to decide to run and be on the ballot? What brought you to that decision? Because you were already doing a lot of work, a lot of great work through LatinxEd. Why this next step?
I think in the process of in LatinxEd of what we call freedom dreaming, we really try to reimagine what our education system can look like. And one of those big issues is access to higher education and just access to greater opportunity in general, right? And so at first, LatinxEd and all my work was pretty direct service oriented and just really building something beautiful for the community. And then as we saw demand, right, for these stories, for this work, so much of that began to get us thinking around some of the systemic challenges that our communities face. And so I was not one that has always been interested in politics, right, my whole life. I barely voted in 2008. That was my first election. Voted for Obama, and I did it out of a friend guilt tripped me into doing it. Right, that I needed to do it. I was not politically aware. Right, I didn't. I'll be honest. I've admitted this several times. I didn't really understand the historical significance of voting for and then electing President Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. I was a second year sophomore at UNC at the time. And when Obama was elected, everyone rushed Franklin Street, right? It was like we won the national championship. I was in my dorm room asleep. I was like, did not participate. I didn't know that that was a thing. Wow. And I like missed this whole sort of chapter of our history of our country because I was just like so busy. Again, I was just like, I got homework to do, right? And so that's sort of where my mind was at that moment in my life. And it wasn't until 2012 for me where like politics, like I had sort of like a political sort of consciousness of like what those decisions meant for our country. That didn't necessarily mean I took a deep dive into politics and advocacy at that moment, but it was just sort of connecting the dots of the stories that we heard from our students and our parents every day, and realizing that there was a limit to what we could get done because of decisions that our county commissioners were making, that our school boards were making, and that our General Assembly were making in Raleigh. And so I went to lobby several times to the General Assembly around issues of tuition equity for DACA students, around college affordability, around issues of income inequality, right? And having those conversations, I was naive and thinking that like, surely maybe they just aren't aware of the challenges in the community, right? And if we like tell a compelling story and we get students to come and like have a good conversation with our elected officials, like how can you say no, right? Like I had fallen in love with my students, right? Because I just think they were the most courageous people on this earth, and just their stories were just incredible to me. I was like, surely everyone feels that way, right? And then going there was such a disappointing sort of trip because you began to see that these stories fell on deaf ears, that they weren't listening or they didn't care to listen, and they didn't see many of our students as part of their communities, right? We had some elected officials tell us that straight out. And so I got really frustrated really, really quickly and began to realize that if we want policy change in North Carolina or really in any community, it won't be until people from those communities that are directly impacted have a voice in this process. And so something that I quoted a lot during the campaign trail was a phrase that goes along the lines of those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and really seeing that our directly impacted community needs to have a seat at the table. And so through my experience on the ground, sort of organizing youth and building LatinxEd, and then sort of the stars also aligning, I met a woman in this journey as I was sort of building LatinxEd and acclimating back to North Carolina, who had been doing organizing work for a lot longer than I have, Yasmin, and was really sort of at the front lines of many of these issues. She grew up in Alamance, and she loved her community, and I saw sort of what that, what's that Cornel West quote, like, justice is what love looks like in public. And so, that's what Yaz's work meant to me, right? And I was just sort of obviously in love with her, but also just like enamored with her work, right? Just like wow, right? Like she's a badass and she's really fighting for what she believes in, right? Like this is what this can look like in North Carolina unapologetically. And so, we get fast forward, we get married, and she happens to live in the most competitive house district in North Carolina. And so moving there, it's like, wow, right? There's opportunities to get involved politically. And by this point, I'm sort of, my mind's buzzing, really sort of following sort of the politics at the local, statewide, and national level. And through my involvement in the Democratic Party, right, I was essentially recruited to jump into the mix. That story of recruitment and sort of campaign itself is a much longer story. It's a much complicated story. Yeah, it was one where I think I was learning what my voice could mean for my community, my district, and the state as I was going through the process, because I was also learning what it meant to be a quote unquote candidate and elected, or not elected official, but a politician, right? Because those are sort of phrases that are still pretty foreign to me, right? When people use them to describe me, I'm just like, I feel more than anything like a community advocate that has sort of found themselves in the political process. But yeah, it's certainly been a journey.
I want to ask for you to give a little bit of background of Alamance, or how have you seen? You mentioned Jasmine grew up there, but can you define a little bit for those maybe who aren't familiar with North Carolina, the geographies? What about Alamance and what makes it competitive, but what also makes it kind of an ironic place to now be represented? And I hope you'll define what I mean by that.
I know exactly what you mean. Alamance is such an interesting, it's such a fascinating community. It reminds me so much of home, where I grew up, my hometown in Lee County in Sanford, just because the politics of it are similar. It's pretty rural, but growing, and defines so much of what North Carolina's past, present, and future look like. It's a rapidly changing community. And so Alamance County finds itself between Greensboro and Guilford County, and Durham County, right? And so sort of it's the suburban sort of district in between these bigger municipalities. It has 3 small towns in it: Burlington, which is the biggest one, Graham, and Mebane. But also sort of gets really rural really quickly, right? In northern Alamance, you have indigenous and historically Black communities that have been there for generations, and also in southern Alamance, gets very rural. It's where you have places like Saxapahaw, which has become really popular off the Haw River. And so for me, it's a microcosm of what's happening in the state and in this country, right? Because beyond just the geography that I described is also sort of how demographic shifts is really creating sort of this culture class of an old and new Alamance, right? We have had a rapidly growing Latinx community here for several decades now, right? Close to 15% of the community is now Latinx, and in a county that is, over 160,000 people at this point. I think the census may tell us even bigger. That's tens of thousands of Latinos that live in Alamance County, historically Black community that's lived here, but also the part that makes it competitive beyond those demographic shifts are all the folks who've been moving out of bigger cities like Greensboro, like Durham, like Raleigh, and even from up north to a place that used to be pretty cheap to live, not so much anymore. And so it's led to sort of this, I think at this point, someone cited the statistic that like 50% of the community was born in Alamance, but then 50% was not born in Alamance, right? Which sort of shows you sort of the sign of the times. To get to your comment though, that's sort of just like your demographer sort of like description of the county. The culture clash here is real, right? Because we've had, with this growing Latino community in particular, some of the most anti-immigrant enforcements and policies passed in North Carolina. And a lot of that is due to sort of law enforcement and how they've handled issues of immigration and a growing community in the past. The sheriff's department was sued by the Department of Justice during the Obama administration over accusations of racial profiling. And we've had a growing sort of grassroots movement who feel like their voices aren't heard and they're being targeted and criminalized in Alamance County. And so we've seen a number of organizations pop up in Alamance to sort of fight back against that narrative, right? Around sort of the historical sort of narrative around communities of color in Alamance. The other piece to all of this that is just really the cherry on top is really its history of of racial inequity, right? Just in terms of poor communities of color and you know what many would call sort of a climate of white supremacy in the county, which is all symbolized by a Confederate monument at the seat of our county government, right, in our court in Graham, North Carolina. And so over the last year or so, since especially since the murder of George Floyd, we've seen protests and just a lot of I want to say manifestaciones, protests, right, in Graham, right, which has really led to collisions with the police department there, with the sheriff's department, and raised a lot of tension and questions in the community around how do we move forward when it feels like we're as divided as we've ever been, right? And so how does the significance of me being elected there, right? It's just like, it's historically been a really conservative red county, and I'm a progressive young Latino Democrat, right? And so it's just like, what? When people, a funny story, actually, I was the first few weeks when I was in the General Assembly, there was a Republican that I was sitting beside in the Appropriations Committee. That's one of the committees that I sit on, and we were chatting before the meeting started, and he asked me where I was from. He welcomed me, really friendly guy, and I told him I was from Alamance, and then he sort of, you could see the wheels turning in his head, and he just sort of looked at me and said, "How the hell did you get elected here?" And so I was like, fair question, you know, like that's the sort of history that Alamance County has, right?
Yeah.
And so the fact that
they're like, this guy's from Durham.
Exactly, right? That's what
Chapel Hill.
right? Exactly. And so, you know, the politics here have historically been really different, but I think it's also a sign of how rapidly Alamance County is changing. And, you know, my district captures sort of that I-85 corridor, that rapidly changing part of the community, that urbanizing part of the community that captures many of the growing cities here in the county. And so, and part of it is the sort of the winds of change too, right? And a lot of what we heard, I mean, we had a lot of Trump Ricky voters, honestly. A lot of people I talked to, right? And sort of, and I think that speaks more to our efforts as a campaign to reaching out to really create, knowing that, you know, to build permanent political power, we needed to really build a multiracial sort of grassroots movement that really found common ground on some key issues in Alamance and in North Carolina, and a lot of folks who really feel a lot of distrust and a lot of this notion of being left behind, right, by government and by our communities. And so we, you know, fought really hard. You know, we talked to a lot of people, and that sort of led to this historical win where I became the first Latino Democrat to ever serve in a General Assembly. And so here I am 4 months in telling you this story.
4 months in.
Yeah, 4 months in.
Exactly. That's what we're telling you. Exclusive. I want to ask you about, I guess, election night. But before that, I guess I wanted to pick up on something that I've been personally mulling over, because it's kind of what you're talking about connecting the dots. I grew up first for a few years in Alamance, and that's shaped some of my experience, right? It's shaped how I've interacted with people. It's shaped who I've had to interact with as well. And now I'm in this setting in rural North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina, in Sampson County. And again, I'm in a setting that's super conservative. Alamance likewise in many ways has and is like that. But I think by growing up in this place and by still having a pretty strong connection to my identity as an immigrant, a person who has very like progressive values, I think it's a different conversation that we or can have about like the politics, the conservative versus progressive, because we interact on a very regular basis with a lot of these people that, like you said, feel left behind, have mistrust of government, have mistrust of like their communities, because not only because they're like our normal everyday people who sit beside us, like with you in your committee, or the advisors I work with, in the administrators, the teachers I work at my school, because it's this ironic situation where we're all educated, especially in the school I'm working with. It's a majority Hispanic school with child of immigrants or immigrants. So we all have this mission of educating like an entire school system and providing resources for them. But our politics are like, basically, I guess, to quote Hamilton, diametrically opposed. And it's just like, it's a surreal experience, because most people from other parts of the country would be like, they hear like, they see a Trump sticker or they hear a thing, they're like, shut that down. There's like no way through. There's no way to like have conversations. But if you're from the South and if you've kind of had this like political awakening, like you look back and like one of my favorite middle school teachers, one of my favorite middle school teachers was like Trump, Trump, Trump. And then it just made me sit and think and like, we have to use our experience to approach this different. It can't be this like hyper nationalized approach, because if not, I don't know who else is going to have like the experience to address it.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, there's a lot there. I question a lot actually, because I think that there's a lot of pressure right now, and I'm a Democrat, so I'll talk about the Democratic Party, right?
Yeah.
Around how we sort of expand the base, right? Or how do we really make sure we continue winning elections, right? And there's this sort of argument, right? This debate whether we expand our base by reaching out to unregistered Black and Latino voters, this new voting block of like young Latinos, right, who we're talking to every day, who we want to be civically engaged, right, to build political power in their communities. Or do you reach to like rural white voters who probably voted for Obama? A lot of them voted for Obama, they voted for Trump, and then voted for Trump again, and who feel just as disconnected and distrustful as the process as some of the other, you know, students and family that we work with every day. And, you know, there's always this like one or the other sort of debate where I feel like, exactly to your point, right? It's just like, I'm glad people ask me all the time how I'm doing this work, right? Like, how do you stay in North Carolina? It's crazy down there. Like, how are you, like, what's going on there, y'all? Because they read the headlines in the New York Times, right?
Yeah.
And all that stuff. And I'm like, y'all, these are like, you say Trump voter, I say one of my good friends from high school, right? Like these are people we grew up with, and they aren't like voters to us. They're like other humans who probably lived in your neighborhood, right? And so just like in a way that like complicates it for me, because it's just like actually a challenge. I think our biggest challenge of our generation, right? How we sort of bridge this divide of this sort of like gaping chasm in our communities. It makes me want to lean into that, right? And like try to solve it, right? Like what do we have in common between like a rural white poor voter in Southern Alamance and the immigrant family from Burlington, right? That we can, you know, are there ways to really find common ground there and build political power in that way, right? I don't know if a lot of people have the patience to explore that question right now, because it's like, it's really tense, right? And I want to acknowledge that too, right? Like we just had an insurrection, right? Like in DC a few months ago, and I'm still saying just because it was literally this year. You know, like the racism in sort of, you know, these voting blocks is real, and sort of how many of our communities have felt attacked and literally been attacked. And so I don't want to discount that at all, and don't want to sound like I'm just like discrediting sort of the real reasons why there's so much polarization right now. But at the same time, right, I don't think this is tenable. And if we want to see changes in our local and statewide and national systems, right, I think we have to figure out a way to build a coalition between all these voters.
A lot of times there seems to be this like sense of like that this work or this approach is mutually exclusive. But in what I've seen and what I've worked with youth, engaging a person from rural Alamance County who's like traditionally Republican or conservative, let's say conservative, and engaging a high school student that has grown up in Alamance County, maybe a lot more of the same thing, because of the setting that they've been, and because of where they've grown up, because of the friends that they have, because the way they interpret society, the way they interpret government, the way they interpret like their economic like capacity is still likely very much in line. So they're not necessarily completely different projects. And that's one of the things that I've kind of like been grappling with, because at this point I'm almost a year removed from undergrad, spent 4 years at a fairly predominantly wealthy institution that had all these resources, all these like international people, but interacting with the folks on the ground who are here just requires doing that lot of work of understanding, right? And to understand a religious rural Latinx immigrant in North Carolina is just as hard sometimes to understand and be able to connect with like a conservative, voter in Alamance County.
Yeah, I completely agree, right? That is so true.
Okay, so before, since we went on that, I wanted to ask the question, like, what was election night for you? Because what was that reaction? Because I remember looking at the votes of all these different counties, and I remember looking at Alamance as well. But what was it like for you? I was just on my laptop.
Yeah, it was a roller coaster, man. It was for a number of reasons. This was, a COVID election. The dynamics of election night just fundamentally were different, right? Because we had such a huge proportion of our communities who voted absentee.
Mhm.
And so that meant that we didn't know their votes, as we know how it played out, right? Nationally, there was more of a lag time, right? We had in North Carolina, I believe, up to 12 days that they could receive the votes to count them officially. And so anything we received on election night was unofficial. And
Mm.
I also didn't want to get my hopes up as to what was happening and then have it overturned by the time we counted all of the absentee ballots, right? And so I'm a very superstitious guy. And so
What
I'm
was
just
your
like,
margin? The final margin?
the final margin was 497 votes. And so I'll get into that piece in a bit, but it was a roller coaster because it's just a roller coaster in general, right? You're like constantly refreshing the feed and also following the presidential race. We had a huge race, obviously,
Yeah.
at the national level. So I'm like sort of going through those motions of like, oh God, is Trump going to get elected again? And what does that mean for our country, right? And sort of what we voted for a second time, and then following the races of not just my race at the state level, but people who had become my friends, other candidates, right? I mean, this wasn't just a race for me. It wasn't just a race about me. It was a race about all of us, right? Like all of us needed to win to sort of take the majority in North Carolina because we needed to win like 6 seats, I believe, in the House of Representatives for Democrats to take power. And so I was watching all the races, right? And then like one by one, right? Like all my friends started losing.
Oh.
And so it was just like you started to see the signs of a rough night, right? That the turnout we needed to win elections across the board wasn't happening in our favor. And so on my end, right, it's really weird because the way precinct votes are counted and how those numbers come in, and just also by when voting blocks choose to vote, right? Whether it's early voting or on the day of election or absentee voting. And so Democrats tend to vote early, right? And so at the first drop of the first votes is at 7:30 p.m. And what they do is they release all the votes that they've already counted before election day, right? And so the first vote count is like hugely in my favor, right? It's like thousands upon thousands of votes. It should be expected, but it is nice to see that, right? It's just like, whoa, like this is happening, right? Like everything is playing out the way it's supposed to. And then after that, between 7:30 and 10:30, just like it felt like every 10-15 a new precinct would drop and that lead would just shrink. It would just shrink every time. And so it was about maybe 9 or 9:30 p.m. where the most conservative precinct in our district, which is a really rural area north of Alamance, it dropped, right? And so it dropped and I was still ahead. And so we saw sort of like, we knew what precincts were left outstanding. And we knew that those were like 50-50 or like, if everything played out the way it was supposed to, like things were looking good. And so after that county dropped, I was like, my stomach dropped because it's like, oh my God, this might happen, right? Like I might win this election. And then it wasn't until like 10:30, 10:45 where you sort of refresh on the Board of Elections as it says like 100% reporting. And you look at the vote count and I'm up by like 300 votes. It's like less than 1%. And it's like, that's all, right? That's all the votes that will come in on election night. And so I was in disbelief. I was looking at my phone. I was like asking my campaign manager, like, does this mean what it think it means, right? Like, did we win? Then we're just sort of all looking around, just like, I think we won, y'all. And so that was just sort of like a surreal moment for us. I wanted to temper expectations. We did have a small watch party, like a COVID safe watch party with like our closest friends and family. And, I had to announce, right? People were like, wanted to sort of have the traditional sort of like, yay, we won, right? Just like champagne
Speech,
bottle
speech,
pop.
speech, speech.
Exactly, right? And I don't wanted to temper expectations. We're just like, we're winning, but we haven't won yet, right? And I was being bombarded by media. Like everyone wanted to call the race. And I was just like, we don't know yet, y'all. We don't know yet, y'all. I'm winning, but we have to wait for the final count. And so the next week and a half was just agonizing, because then you just wait, right? Like, what's going to come out? And the other detail to this is that because it was so close, if the election is determined by less than 1%, your opponent can call a recount.
Mhm.
And so we were waiting to see what that final vote count was in order for us to see whether, whether we were in danger of that. And so finally, what felt like the longest week and a half of my life, the final absentee ballots dropped, and they certified the election, and I ended up winning by 497 votes, which was 1.2% margin, which means they couldn't challenge it with a recount. And yeah, the rest is history. So.
Oh man, that is definitely a roller coaster. Because I remember, I think I just saw the election night part. I was like, yeah, that was like the consolation prize for North Carolina, just like letting me down. But next time. But
Yeah.
no, but I think I was just like, after election night, I was excited, I was happy, but you were stuck with it a lot longer.
Oh, a lot longer, yeah.
So I think there's so much to that, I think, story, and I hope you share a lot more, because it's this journey of like, we've had a few local Latinx leaders win in Durham and kind of take that, but it's like, again, the irony of the setting. My parents actually live in Graham now, so like, shout out to that. But like, it wasn't coming from a Durham, it wasn't coming from a Charlotte necessarily, in terms of like the General Assembly. It was coming from this region that has so many clashes, right? Cultural, political, economic. I think I find it fascinating, because I think it'll be able to inform a lot of other youth who, have some of these aspirations to like represent and be a voice for their community. So that's amazing. Now, to start closing off our conversation, my last question about this is something that I've mentioned it in previous Nuestro South conversations, but also I've been thinking about given the past election year, is for those youth that maybe you work with, or for the youth that you are familiar with from the South, from North Carolina, how would you, now as a representative, how would you kind of like promote this idea of like being a citizen in a much broader sense of the words, or how to citizen? Because a lot of times, whether it's politically, I think our experience or knowledge of it is stunted, especially if there's like status and immigration involved with that, but also by the lack of representation that we see within our own institutions. So how would you, tell a young sophomore, junior in high schooler how to citizen, how to become engaged?
You got good questions today, Axel. I think for me, what it fundamentally boils down to is this notion that you are the expert of your own experience, right? And I think when you understand that as a young person, or just really as anyone, right, in our community, is when there's begins to develop a sense of agency to have your voice heard, right? And to tell your story and all of its messiness, right? The challenges you face, the opportunities, the heartaches, right? The victories, all of it. And I think that sort of approach for me is when people begin to listen or not listen, right? Which is and when we begin to see that happening is when, I guess, sort of that social fabric begins to develop, because, right, what I've seen happen is like storytelling is magical for me, right? I love sort of when people get up on the mic and just sort of share their story, right? Whether it's in an artistic form or just like them telling about themselves, because I feel like the people around you sort of like feel a connection to you, right? So there's just like this sort of like inertia of like, me too, right? Or people sort of begin to sort of almost cipher, right? Just like, oh, like what we were doing in the beginning of this conversation, right? Like, oh, that's triggered from my upbringing, right? And then you share what you went through, and then it's just like becomes this thing, and like you all of a sudden you look around, it's just like folks who share a lived experience. It's just like, wow, right? Like, I didn't realize this community existed, right? And like for me, that's how it starts, right? Like one story is a ripple that sort of just like transcends a community. And so for me, being a citizen is sort of this like continuous act of sharing these stories, because then it sort of activates the community that will then allow us to really dream, right? And what we talk about in LatinxEd is sort of this notion of freedom dreaming, right? Like, what can our communities actually look like? And I think first, we sort of have to find that sort of common thread that unites all of us. And then that's sort of the dreams almost naturally come out of that, right? Because I feel like we're sort of wired to dream as children of immigrants and just as human beings almost, right? Where we're just sort of thinking about what does the other side look like? And I have seen that happen with our students. I've seen that happen with my friends, with community members in my campaign. I didn't realize I would love campaigning, but that was what campaigning was, right? It was an opportunity to build a vision of what our future could look like collaboratively, right? And just to sort of like hold on to hopes and dreams of what we could be together. And I just fell in love with that notion of people coming together. And I think that for me is, you know, what it's about, right? The voting part, like the electoral process part, is a tool, right? And in this process, but there's so many ways to be civically engaged, right? Serving on boards, on commissions, on nonprofits, serving, you know, we have so many unsung heroes in our communities, right? Like the person in the, you know, in a traila, right, that just makes that, like, cooks on the weekend and like invites all the kids over, right? Or just like folks who make sure that you're going to make it to the hospital on time, right? Or who can provide transportation. Like we see the sort of all these sort of acts of philanthropy and service all the time, but we don't necessarily code them as like civic engagement or public service or donations, right? Like a big complaint that I always hear at institutions especially, right? Just like, well, our, like, you know, our levels of donation among like our Latinx alumni or whatever are really low, or like we don't know how to engage with this community. I'm like, they like, we like, I feel like live a life of service so often, right? And I feel like that so much of it is reflected in sort of just like how our communities have had to survive in this country for so long, right? Like you think of really innovative practices like tandas, right? And like all these things where people just sort of band together to take care of each other. And so we practice it more than we realize, right? But then it becomes a question of like, well, what does that practice of citizenship look like on a bigger, more public scale beyond sort of like your neighborhood, right? And then to then begin to engage in a more formal way with the institutions that we know, right? Like elections, like our board of commissioners, like our boards of education, and what that means to influence institutions that hold so much power in our communities.
I think that's essentially what I was discussing in a previous conversation, that our communities know what's lacking. They know what they probably need. They don't always have the voice to express it, but they feel it and experience it. And we had this one conversation where we were talking about a church who was making demands to have services in Spanish. And it was super interesting because it was this, I was reading the example and it was like so fascinating how, because they felt that they could claim that institution, then they could practice this sense of like making demands, communicating. So I totally sympathize with what you're saying. Like a lot of these roles of caretakers, a lot of these roles of advocates exist already, but it's a process to make this community feel that the political institutions really also are willing to include them.
Exactly, and when our communities collectively realize that, I think it's going to be a game changer, right? Look at places like Siler City, look at places like Sanford, you know, Sampson County, right? Like look at the numbers there, right?
I've told them they could take over if they want to.
Y'all could have Latino mayor if you wanted to, right? Like let's focus, y'all.
Okay, and to close, I have two last quick questions. We'll see if they're not too difficult. I wanted to ask, what is a political poder that you believe is emerging or still untapped within North Carolina Latinx Southerners?
Ooh, political poder.
This might be useful for your next election.
I mean, it's everything we're talking about, but I think flexing that voice and getting really involved in our educational systems, right? I think we have an outsized role in so many public education systems in North Carolina. Again, I'll allude back to Lee County schools, 39% Latino, right? Like 40% of your schools identify as Hispanic or Latino, right? Alamance County, 25%, right? Like you go through the list, right? Just like our schools are a reflection of what our future in North Carolina looks like in terms of the proportion of our community that's gonna be Latino, right? If our parents got involved now, if our students got involved now, like it could, I think, accelerate where we need to go, right? By beginning to reimagine what these systems can look like within our education system. I think that for me is what is so appealing about working in the education space, because it's something that our parents and students immediately get because they're
Yeah.
experiencing every day. And it's almost like a mini sort of round of like what civic engagement can feel like and look
Yes.
like, right? Like go talk to your teacher, go talk to your school, right? Like we know those institutions. And then eventually I want you to go testify in front of the county commissioners, right? But I won't tell you that at the moment. But yeah, it's sort of like building power within sort of our education system will allow folks to feel like, oh, we actually have a voice in our community, right? And they need to be aware of some of the failures of our systems and the challenges that we face, and see where we can go forward from there.
That's a great point. By being at a school where I am, I totally see that. That's a great strategy. Let's go 2022. So last question, and this is kind of putting you in the spot because I think you're so much in the weeds of what this project already is, but maybe hopefully you can think of something like external of just like the work we've been doing. But what is something that, based on your experience, represents the concept of Nuestro South that we came up with a couple of years ago?
I think it was probably me mentoring a young Latino student from my hometown when I was in college. And very simply being able to share my story of what it meant to grow up in Lee County, what it meant to go to college, and why I was doing it, right? The sort of Nuestro South mantra, right, of this is for us, y'all, right? Like it's sort of like that was the message I essentially sent to him.
Mm.
And I think that story, he's told me this too, right? Like sort of really allowed him to see a lot further into the future than he thought could be possible, right? And so I think that by me sharing my stories, it opened up an imagination for him that he, to think about what his future could look like that he didn't think was possible. I think with Nuestro South and us sharing our stories, we're doing the same thing, right? We're sort of like serving as connective tissue to sort of connect the dots all across North Carolina and all across the Southeast, right? We're just like the stories of our families and our communities in like Sampson County or, Wilmington or the mountains here are probably pretty similar to what's happening in the suburbs of Atlanta and in like, DeKalb, Georgia, and all these places, right? And what does that mean for sort of this emerging community, growing community in the South, right? And I sort of love that, right? We're sort of defining who we are in real time, which is pretty cool.
Well, thank you so much for that, Representative Ricky Hurtado. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, man. This is fun.